So yeah, our approach is in response to the need for action on climate change. There's a global scientific consensus that climate change above 2 degrees centigrade is going to cause irreversible damage to the planet's systems. We're now at about 1.2 degrees centigrade increase on pre-industrial levels. Pre-industrial CO2 levels were about 280 parts per million. We're now above 400 parts per million. And we know that this is coming from human activity, from fossil fuels, oil and gas, and natural gas, and also, as we'll see, from a range of other different emissions sources. We've known since the Conference of Parties, which is underway now, has been running, that there's a need for governments to take action on climate change. And governments have been, in a sense, kind of sitting on their hands for the last 16 years, trying to mobilize capital into international markets to invest in emissions reductions, and have had some success, but fairly limited success. And what we're seeing from countries in the world that have the biggest potential to make those reductions is really strongly renewed interest in finding solutions working within the private sector, as opposed to depending on government. So if we understand, first of all, where these emissions are coming from, this graph shows the growth in emissions from 1990 to 2019. This area in orange is the area that most of us think about when we think about CO2 emissions, so fossil fuel-based carbon dioxide emissions. But they represent about 65, maybe 70% of the total emissions, and they've been growing consistently with other emission sources. CH4 is methane. That's an important source of emissions as well. N2O, which comes from agricultural activities, is important. But the combination of methane production as well as land use change represents about 20% of global emissions. And I'll come back to why that's important in a moment. But when we tend to think about big cement plants and oil and gas facilities as the problem, actually at least 20% of the problem is coming from land use change, from deforestation and degradation of land around the world, like large-scale deforestation in North America and Europe, which happened a couple of hundred years ago, and very rapid deforestation now of countries where we're very, very active. So where we've seen the business opportunity in this space is to say, well, if we can invest in either replanting trees, mobilizing capital to pay people to not cut the trees down in the first place, protecting mangrove ecosystems, then we can address at least 20% of the causes of climate change. Another quick graphic, and again, I'm very happy to send this PowerPoint around at the end of the session. The graphic on the left just shows the red line here from left to right from 1990 to 2020, which just shows how much China's greenhouse gas emissions have grown relative to other countries. The EU has actually seen declining emissions. The US has been fairly stable. So what we've seen with China over the last two decades is, as we outsource manufacturing to countries like China and Southeast Asia, those emissions that used to happen in the US and Europe are now happening there. The emissions per capita, the total per person there, are still much higher in the US and in Russia than they are in China. But again, those emissions per capita are growing, and that's part of the problem we're trying to solve. If we look at where the greenhouse gas emissions come from, as I said before, 2/3 is from carbon dioxide, but a big portion comes from forestry and land use change, from burning of forests. A big portion comes from methane as well, which comes both from industrial sources and then also from land use change. And then if we want to look on the right-hand side about what energy, what sources of emissions, what activity is generating them, electricity and heat is a big portion. Transportation, we tend to think about as being much larger than it is. It's about 14%. Even aviation, which tends to be targeted, is less than 5% of global emissions. So these big buckets of emissions activities where in general, people think we should be focusing our activities. So to get to this 2 degrees centigrade stabilization, on the left-hand side, you see the kind of business as usual up to 2030. The blue line in the middle here is what happens if we do nothing. To get to a 2 degrees centigrade emissions reduction by 2030, we have to reduce emissions by between 12 and 15 gigatons, so 12 to 15 billion tons of emissions reductions. And that's a big number. That's a huge challenge globally. If we look at the composition of that power in the graph on the right, We see 12 gigatons coming from power, 7 coming from industry, but a significant portion here again coming from deforestation and land use change. So if we want to hit these climate stabilization targets, we're going to have to do a lot of work, as we see on the right, to reduce energy use within those sectors, to switch to electric vehicles in some cases, to build more energy efficient homes, to change fuel and aviation. But what we've also seen happen, and this is a really new phenomenon over the last 3 or 4 years, is large numbers of companies making massive net zero commitments as part of their commitments to shareholders. So those net zero commitments, the first 104 companies to make those commitments represented about $1.4 trillion of market capitalization. The Net Zero Asset Management Initiative has $68 trillion of assets under management. The Net Zero Banking Alliance has $72 trillion of assets under management. And basically what these different private sector organizations have said, it's not enough for us to rely on government. We need to take action and we need to make our own net zero commitments as companies to either reduce our emissions or offset them by investing into carbon credits around the globe. And so that 15x increase in the demand for carbon credits is going to come from those companies realizing those net zero commitments. And while many people have been skeptical in the past about whether those net zero commitments are binding, with increasing scrutiny from the SEC and the EU, that kind of scale of commitments is now effectively a commitment that was made to shareholders. It's attracted capital, and they're increasingly going to be regulated and enforced by the SEC and by European regulators. So the challenges of achieving net zero when we've got aviation and transportation and heavy reliance on fossil fuels is really going to require a massive shift and investment towards carbon credit production, not as the entire solution, but certainly as part of the short-term goals. A lot of people, I've been involved in the carbon market since 2005. My PhD was in environmental sciences in environmental risk. I set up the first voluntary market carbon credit company in Canada, which made the Olympics carbon neutral. And we went through a really interesting early wave from 2005 to 12 of large-scale carbon credit production. What happened at the end of that period was the US withdrew from the Kyoto Agreement. The aviation industry never made their commitments to go carbon neutral. And we ended up with a system that was oversupplied with credits and insufficient demand. What's changed now, what's new in this current market is, as I said before, this massive increase in demand from corporate buyers, making these commitments to their shareholders, and individual corporations like Apple, Netflix, Nestle, Microsoft, Amazon are now huge buyers of carbon credits within this system, because in many cases, these new super majors in the tech sector represent some of the fastest growing sources of emissions. So this time is very different, and it's backed by a much higher level of demand. This graphic's got a lot of information in it, but what I really want to draw attention to here is the 2 red lines in the middle indicate how much carbon goes up into the atmosphere from human activity. So this is carbon rather than carbon dioxide. And we're looking at somewhere around 9 gigatons of carbon per year effectively moving into the atmosphere in this graphic. And why this is important is when we look at the carbon that's exchanged with the surface of the ocean, the carbon that's stored in trees, there's 100 times more carbon stored 11 times more carbon stored in all the biomass on the planet than is emitted by humans. And if you look at the surface of the ocean, where we're doing lots of projects looking at things like mangroves, there's 90 to 100 times more carbon in flux in the surface of the ocean than there is in human emissions each year. So when we talk about nature-based solutions, what we're talking about actually is taking those systems and making them do the job that they were designed for through evolution and sequester carbon in much greater levels. When we talk about nature-based solutions, we're talking about avoided deforestation projects, which means buying out forest licenses, protecting areas that would otherwise be cut down. This is one of the biggest areas of activity in carbon credit production, paying for restoration and reforestation projects on a large scale. We have 60,000 hectares that we're about to finance in Sierra Leone. We have about 100,000 hectares of mangrove protection projects under what's called blue carbon projects. And then we work with agricultural systems as well to change the way that land is managed to sequester more carbon. So what we think, if we go back to the previous graph, is if we can make investments into the rest of the systems on the planet, they have enormous capacity to improve the amount of carbon that's sequestered. We don't solve the problem of human emissions by that, but we think we can generate somewhere between 8 and 12 gigatons of carbon credits. So if you look, again, based on the Mark Carney report, the total volume of practical potential of carbon credits is 8 to 12 gigatons per year. Somewhere between 65 and 85% of that can come from nature-based solutions, from avoided deforestation, mangrove protection, and restoration of degraded areas. Although there's huge potential from technology-based projects, they tend to be much more expensive. So we focused, and we think the biggest opportunities are on this end of the spectrum because they're the largest projects and the lowest cost projects. And what we think is going to happen is many of these projects will be invested in, the cheap ones will be exhausted, and then people will shift to things like direct carbon capture and storage, which is showing promising results, but nature-based solutions need prices of $15 to $30 a ton, and carbon capture and storage needs prices of $100 to $200 a ton. So we think this is where most of the activity over the next 7 or 8 years is going to happen through nature-based solutions. I'll just push through, and I can circle back here for questions. Carbon credit production is a very well-established discipline now. So a company like KLX, as an owner-operator, will come into a region, will identify, let's say, forest land that we can restore. We develop what's called a project description. We describe the land title, the ownership of that land, the amount of carbon it's going to sequester, the production. And then that's sent to a third-party auditor that generates a reasonable assurance standard, a document related to that. So it's all third-party validation, much in the way that financial accounts are validated. Then the project is implemented, whether that's protecting the land or planting. And then every year after the project's implemented, the operators produce a verification report to show that the tons are still, the trees are still there, the credits are still there, and the credits are still being produced. And it's only after the fact, after you can demonstrate that the credit production is happening, that you can release a vintage of tons. Those tons go into a registry, which you can see here in this diagram. They're stored in a static registry. So if Shell buys those tons, they're retired in Shell's name. And they have a unique serialized number, so they can't be double sold. There's a very robust system that's been set up for measuring and managing carbon credit production. So within this ecosystem, companies like Klimat X sit on the left-hand side of the diagram here. So the technical project manager and consultant, and in many cases, we'd be the asset owner. The asset owner might also be a government. It might be a large landowner. And then the project financing leads are coming from, in many cases, from funds, from companies like us, and then from large final buyers that want to prepay to access the tons. Once the credits are produced, they're sold either directly to a final emitter or through a buyer, which might be a fund. And ultimately, those credits are unlikely to be traded speculatively. They're more likely to just be retired in the registry against the emissions liabilities of someone like Shell or BP. And then just in terms of the economics of these projects, it takes 1 to 2 years to develop a project to completion. We look at spending somewhere around $2 to $3 million on project development and validation. Once you've got a project validated, and I developed a project in the DRC in 2010 to 12, where we spent less than $2 million developing the project. That project for 25 to 30 years could produce 3 million tons per year at $10 to $20 per ton. So the upfront cost compared to things like oil and gas projects isn't the challenge. It's relatively cheap and easy to develop these projects, and they produce an annuity of tons for up to 30 years. The problems with many of these projects is that if you look at the 10 top jurisdictions around the world for producing carbon credits, They're all in equatorial regions, often in places that have weak rule of law, challenges with land title, and challenges with just operating in the context of political risk and political insecurity. So many of the most interesting and viable places to work in the world are also some of the most difficult places to work in the world. And that's really been the single biggest barrier to the development of many of these projects. And so the approach we've taken as a company is to focus on negotiating agreements with the governments first, with being very transparent about what their share of the take is, about what proportion of the revenues they're going to share in, make sure we can work within those countries to establish title and ownership of the projects, and then fund them with very clear, transparent benefit sharing agreements. And we think the standards in this market are growing towards much higher levels of transparency than we've seen in the past. And when a project is going to last 30 to 50 years in some cases, it has to be robust enough to survive big changes in government. It has to properly compensate the government so they don't feel the need to revisit it later. And it has to be done on the basis of the best available science. And just as a showcase, the project that I helped to start and launch it's called the Mine-Dombe project in the DRC, 300,000 hectares of land developed by my old company and a company called Wildlife Works. Just as an example of what happens if you get it right, that project's now been producing tons for 12 years, has strong community engagement, building hospitals, strong revenue sharing arrangements with the government. And ultimately, the reason the project works is the government makes much more money out of this kind of project than they would have made out of securing stumpage fees from forest land development from foreign forestry companies coming in. So if you design these projects right, ultimately the reason that they work is they're a much better source, longer term source of income than even forestry or conversion to agriculture will be. And the difference can be in some jurisdictions for, let's say, carbon projects compared to conversion to palm oil or soybean production or even rangeland, can be a 5 to 10-fold difference in the NPV from the project. So if you build these projects right, everyone can win. There's no downside. So I'll stop the sharing there, and I know I've covered a lot of ground. I'm very happy to open up to questions and hear what your questions, or feel free to be skeptical, or I've probably answered every possible question in this topic.
James, one question that I had. What's the lifespan of a nature-based project? So let's say you said 1 to 2 years, I heard you say, and then it would produce the carbon credits that the company can sell. But then what happens to that land?
So that project, the crediting period for these projects will be anywhere from 10 to 50 years. So if we do our replanting project in Sierra Leone, which we're very close to securing the initial funding on, we've already planted 400 hectares, that will produce credits for 50 years. Shorter term mangrove projects, which are protection projects, might be as short as 10 years, but typically our projects are anywhere from 20 to 50 years. So you get that annuity stream from that project. And in some cases, we're seeing large final buyers like Shell and Trafigura buying out the entire project for its lifespan for 30 years. So if you manage the risk well, which is what we try to do as a company and as a developer and explorer, we kind of act. The explorers and development companies act like junior mining companies, and once they've de-risked the projects with their own equity, it's likely that the majors come in and buy out the entire projects. And I think we're going to see that much more commonly.
Another question I had here: who are your competitors for Klimat X, or who else is doing this? And if they're not, how come we don't see more companies doing this?
Yeah, it's a great question. So in the context of public exchanges, Klimat X is the only owner-operator of projects that is listed and is pursuing this kind of model. In the private sector, in the private space, there's a number of different funds, Invert, HSBC, Pollination, South Pole, all operating as private companies in the sector. The reason I felt last year that we should take this company public is that the TSXV is the place where all these major commodities have been able to attract capital. New and emerging commodities like battery technologies, battery metals, uranium, lithium, even with some reticence now, I suppose, even things like blockchain can attract capital and risk capital and grow very rapidly on public exchanges. So we're really the only one that we're aware of that's on a large listed exchange. And I wanted it to be on a commodity exchange because I believe this is just in many ways a new commodity space and sector. So if you need to look, then the majority of the rest of them are private. The companies in the carbon space that did go public last year, like carbon streaming, were streaming and royalty companies. And my concern about their model from the beginning was that there was not enough upstream production for them to stream against, and the streaming companies would be competing directly with the large final buyers of carbon credits who have a huge appetite for tons. So streaming as part of a mature commodities ecosystem makes all kinds of sense. It's a great business model. It's a light, asset light model, but you do have to have upstream production. And the pain point we'd identified was this is an artisanal business. Nobody's working at jurisdictional scales, and we need to mobilize capital upstream into much larger scale projects. So, the streaming and royalty companies, I think, will have their day in 5 years when there's a lot more supply to stream against. But we wanted to be a listed owner and operator of projects.
One question I have here, what happens, I think it's from NEO, and apologies if I'm not pronouncing that properly. What happens if you plant a forest and then there's a forest fire that destroys it?
So when you develop a project document, you build in risk buffers for the predicted likelihood that there'll be carbon credits, a fire within the project site. And basically what happens is you take those carbon credits and you set them to one side as an insurance buffer and an insurance pool. And then when you list the project on the registry, a portion of everybody's tons goes into a self-insurance pool. So if there's what's called a reversal, let's say through a landslide or a fire, those tons are replaced from the self-insurance pool. So while you have emissions occurring, let's say from forest fires in California, which did affect some carbon credits, the buyers of those credits still have access to the self-insurance pool. In tropical forests, where we do a lot of our projects, we definitely build in fire risk. We see that as an issue, but it's less of a fire risk than in subtropical and temperate regions in most cases. But there is an entire mechanism to make sure that if there is a fire, if there's a reversal or some sort of event, then we have to factor that we have replacement tons.
You touched a little bit about the credibility. Can you elaborate on the SROs that are issuing these climate credits?
Yeah, I mean, by SROs, I mean the certification agencies that issue carbon credits. The largest one in the world is Verra. Verra was originally called the Voluntary Carbon Standard. Probably 80% of global tons now are issued through Verra. They're a global non-profit organization. They're a bit like an accounting standards organization. So they create the protocols and guidance rules for how carbon credit projects need to be produced. They provide all that guidance, you follow the rule book, and then they certify the validators and verifiers. So they sort of act as the audit entity organization that manages the entire system. There are others, there's groups like Plan Vivo and Gold Standard that also do these kinds of carbon credit projects. But the biggest by far is called Verra, VERRA, and they have a fully transparent registry where you can go and look up projects. And once you sign up, you can also find out who's bought and retired those projects. It's a very robust assurance system now.
One thing, can you talk a little bit about your project in Yucatan? Because we didn't hear too much about that one.
Yeah, sure. I didn't go too much into our existing projects, but in Yucatan, we have an agreement with the governor, signed by the governor of Yucatan, to develop investment frameworks for protecting all of the mangroves in the coastal zone in the state of Yucatan. We're also looking at the neighboring states, but in most cases, these mangrove projects have been damaged or degraded because roads have been built along the beachfront. The roads cut off tidal supply, so the water where the mangroves are becomes too salty, and then the mangroves die back. And effectively what we're doing in those project areas is reflooding those areas with tidal waters. So building culverts and bridges that restore the tidal flows. And actually you get a large amount of natural regeneration when you do that. We have a similar project in Suriname and Guyana signed at the national level by the President's Office, where we'll be restoring mangroves along significant stretches of the entire coastline of those countries. In Sierra Leone, we have a very large-scale rewilding project, which is reforestation, as well as mangrove restoration projects where degraded land that's been converted to rice paddies, actually in some places, very low-value rice paddies, are being converted back into mangroves. And to put it into context, these projects will sequester 15 to 20 tons of carbon per hectare per year. So for what we invest and what we've been able to model, it's attractive. We modeled 20 to 30% unlevered IRRs for these projects. So if you build the project right, then the investments are very attractive. And then we've just come back from COP with the goal of signing up a number of other jurisdictions. So we're working in places like Kurdistan, Mongolia, Guinea, Liberia, as well as expanding the mandate in Mexico to a national framework.
Just one more question, I think, and then I don't know if anybody else has anything, but can you expand just a little bit on what lessons and why you have leadership from the oil and gas sector and how that comes into play?
Yeah, it's a great question. When I put the board together for the company, I took the view that the way that the industry had developed so far is it had been developed by relatively inexperienced environmental consultants who would come in and do small scale projects. It was a bit like the kind of gold rush in the Yukon in the 1860s, and they'd find a little nugget of gold, except it was carbon, and sort of run down to the village and sell it. And what I wanted to do is build a company board and an advisory board that had real depth of experience in commodity markets, borrowing things like production sharing contracts from oil and gas contracting, which are going to be familiar to investors and analysts, and say, look, these kind of production sharing contracts, which is how most of the world's oil and gas has been developed, apply just as well to carbon credit projects. They give us a framework for negotiating with governments. And then many of the people who spend much of their life in the oil and gas sector or the mining sector, and want to do something that's a legacy for their kids to some extent, recognize that they can open doors in many of these countries, that they can get us in front of, presidents and leaders and decision makers in these countries. And we can negotiate because of the trust relationships, sort of top-down jurisdictional deals with this. Now, some of the environmentalists we speak to take issue with us working with people from the oil and gas sector, but I take the view that if we can be as successful as that sector's been at mobilizing capital and using it for, reversing many of those problems, we're going to have a much stronger foundation.
James, one more here from Cole. Let's see, what challenges does the industry face as a whole moving forward that you see? Like, what are the biggest?
Yeah, I mean, our experience has been actually that we're, I guess there's sort of two different answers to that question. One is there's technical challenges, which is when you start looking at an entire jurisdiction's whole countries, you don't necessarily have enough data to understand what's even there. So there's a huge effort at the moment in things like satellite and monitoring companies to mobilize carbon credit monitoring systems using satellite data to fix some of those challenges. The second big technical challenge is there's just not that many people in the world who've developed millions of tons of carbon credits. I mean, in my previous life and my earlier experiences, I've produced over 50 million tons of carbon credits. We produce 4 million tons a year in the DRC. We produce 1 million tons a year in the Great Bear Rainforest. And there's just not that many people who understand how to do it. So that's a rate limiting step. I think in the public market setting and from an investor's perspective, there's some skepticism about whether these transactions are real. There was skepticism last year about what would happen if there was a recession. Everyone believed that these commitments companies were making would disappear and they'd walk away from them. And, now when we talk to Shell and BP and Vitol, they say with the profits that they made in the last year, they're under even more pressure now to execute on these types of carbon credit projects. So, there's a sort of, it's an early market, there's some credibility challenges. our big focus as a company has been to do what we do upstream with exploration and site and project development. And at the other end of the value chain, negotiate and finalize contracts with large final buyers like BP and Shell. And we're in the final stages of that process, and we'll be making some major announcements in December. So there's just this sort of sniff test, credibility test about whether all this stuff is real, which we encounter a lot. So we've gone out and pushed ahead very aggressively to say, look, you can, in less than 12 months, we can go from a standing start to producing, 28 million tons of carbon credits, which is sort of the range that we're working within.
How, there's in line with another question here, how can you be sure when you go to the more corrupt countries, let's say, right, that the carbon credit agreements will be honored over the next 20 to 30 years? So how do you negate some of that risk now? And
yeah, I mean, there's lots of legal answers to that, which is, getting MEGA insurance, getting support from international organizations, getting strong, robust legal advice within those countries. All of that's great. That all helps. But in the end, the equation works because our carbon credits are the best and highest and most valuable use of most tropical forests. So as long as the government's being fairly compensated for that, they'll always make more money doing a forest carbon project than they'll make from a timber project. So in the end, it becomes less about what the government sees. There's a bit of a credibility test as well there, but it's making sure that communities get some share of the compensation so they don't come around at night and cut down the trees. But ultimately, what I think makes these projects work in the long term is just the economics. It's just, it's a much better and higher use of the forest areas than any other competing use.
Great. Well, I think that unless anybody has any more questions, I think we'll plan on, as James said, we'll be willing to share the deck with you after. If you have any other questions, please field them through Cole or myself, and we'll be happy to get those answered for you. And we really appreciate you taking the time. Anything else you want to say, James, to close it out? Or
no, just appreciate your time. Please stay in touch. We've got a great team and lots of very strong news flow over the next few months. And please reach out directly to myself or Julie or Cole if you have any questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.